Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. And in this session, we'll be discussing paradoxes, polarities, and paradigm shifts in the field of organizing. When moving from command and control to teal, it's easy to get away with the paradigm shift that we all want to see in the world. And my guest for today states that if we want to create a paradigm shift, swinging the pendulum doesn't work. He will share his knowledge and experience and views about how we can make the shift, and his name is Benjamin Taylor. Benjamin is Chief Executive of the Public Service Transformation Academy, Managing Partner at Red Quadrant, and a Non-Executive Director at Systems and Complexity in Organization, or for short, SCIO, the Systems Practitioners Organization. He's been in public service reform and organizational effectiveness for over 20 years. He's always been an avid organizational learner of systems thinking, which he traces back to reading his dad's 60s and 70s sci-fi novels, studying philosophy with politics and economics at Oxford University, and being an outsider. He describes himself as a business evolutionary. Benjamin began work as a database developer, personal carer, and at a youth development charity. Then he worked on the front line in a local authority advice center. He spent 7 years at the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham as advisor to leader, amongst other roles. At PricewaterhouseCoopers and sector projects, his work included customer strategy for Birmingham City Council and advice to the government of Armenia. He founded Red Quadrant in 2009, now a top 10 public service transformation consultancy in the UK. Benjamin established the Public Service Transformation Academy, a not-for-profit social enterprise which builds the capacity of public services to transform themselves, with the UK Cabinet Office commissioning Academy as a jewel in the crown of its offer. He has also lectured in applied systems thinking at various universities and business schools. Benjamin is particularly interested in system leadership, systems change, service design, and service transformation. And today, in this session, he's here. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Benjamin. Thank you so much for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's an absolute pleasure, and a pleasure to hear you reading out those things. It reminded me a lot of fun and interesting times. It sounded good, actually.
Yeah, and I hope that many people who are watching that they now have, if they don't know you already, have a clearer idea of who you are. And if they do not, then they'll definitely will in our conversation, because we have a couple of very interesting topics that we want to cover in the field of organizing. And what you say, or what I also read in your introduction, is that you are passionate about the possibilities of transformation, and you describe yourself as a business evolutionary. Now, how does a business evolutionary look at the possibilities for transformation in general, and specifically in the public service sector?
Well, let me start from some real basics. As soon as you enter into working in the service industry, and especially public services, with a kind of systemic thinking or a disruptor mindset, or just somebody who's willing to have a look around and see how things run. And almost everybody actually has this experience early in their career, at least.
Yeah.
You see so many opportunities for things to be done better. You see so many times that we are fooling ourselves, making life harder for ourselves, making life harder for our customers, and all of those kind of things. I want to say, though, as part of this conversation, and I love your metaphor of swinging the pendulum doesn't create the paradigm shift. I think that's what you created in our earlier conversations. That initial frustration and almost indignation that services could and should be so much better isn't enough, and that we sometimes get carried away in a reactionary, reflexive response to that, and therefore we get into everything must be swept away and done differently. And I
Yeah.
fell for this 100% when I was a young employee at Hammersmith and Fulton Council. I wrote a 14-page memo to the chief executive telling him how everything should be done and that we were managing everything wrong. He was a kindly chap, and he took me aside and told me that probably wasn't the way to change things. So that's my starting point.
Yeah.
There is so much potential for human potential in organization and in the experience of organizations inside and outside. Gets crushed.
Yeah.
But if we seek to sweep everything away, that's why I'm an evolutionary, not a revolutionary. We genuinely can get rid of the baby with the bathwater, as we say.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're talking about possibilities for transformation. And I'd like to zoom into what you just said, that you are an evolutionary, not a revolutionary. And just for us, what's the distinction in your opinion?
So I think we talk all too glibly about paradigm shifts and about moving into new eras. I studied kind of history of thought, and I'm fairly suspicious of that idea that history is a progression towards the current, exalted state we're about to move into in the future. It's caused a bit of trouble in human history, to be fair.
Yeah.
So while it's really attractive and it's brilliant to have the examples, for example, that Frederick Laloux brings out in Reinventing Organizations, there have been predictions that the dinosaur organizations that don't understand the new way of thinking from at least Deming onwards, and probably before Deming, would die away, but they're still with us. While it's true that bad systems provide closed, self-predictive, responsive things, I think we also have to say that it's the easy job, as Laloux once said, and I think being a bit self-deprecating, but it's the easy job to find the people who are willing and the places who are willing and the leaders and the owners who are willing and create something new. The majority of humankind working in organization is and will be in a traditional hierarchical organization for as far as I can see into the future. So I think that the real work is to gradually and or as quickly as we can, but work with hierarchical, old style, basic organizations to make them more functional and systemic. I think that's harder work than trying to sweep them away, but I think it's the really important work, and that's kind of what I am spending my time doing for sure.
Yeah. So what you're actually saying then is that the evolutionary is about doing the hard work that's definitely not as flashy and shiny as going with the big wave of the startups and the all agile movement and all that. But on the other hand, it's also about, because I recall that we've had a number of speakers at the Systemic Leadership Summit who spoke about the evolution and how technology is throwing us forward and pushing us forward. And so the speed at which that's going is just forces organizations that are really big to be able to go along with that movement. So I'd like to stay here with you for a couple of minutes and really zoom into this, because what I understood there is that the growth is exponential. And so it's not like the bigger organizations, the dinosaurs, as you call them, are still here because they stood the test of time. It's more like technological evolution is not, it's exponential. So there will be a point where from one day to the next, the dinosaurs will become extinct. And I just compare it to, for example, having a cell phone. It's not too long ago that we didn't have cell phones. And that was in your and my lifetime, I mean, there's
Yeah.
whole generations who grew up with cell phones. But now all those old dinosaur phones that hung on your wall are completely extinct. They're gone. Only collectors love collecting them, but there's
Yep.
hardly anyone using them. And it seemed like that happened from one day to the next. So that's what
Yeah.
I mean by, what's your distinction in terms of
Well,
revolutionary and evolutionary, and why do you
yeah.
feel that we need to help the dinosaurs in their process? Because it may be that once we're done working with them, it's already too late.
Well, I mean, waiting for or even fomenting the revolution feels to me like too small of a god to serve, to coin the Peter Block phrase, for two reasons.
Mhm.
The first is that we have to be careful about, we have to take, hold ourselves to account for the implications of our rhetoric.
Mhm.
And there are all kinds of shadow sides swept up in the good intentions or just misty-eyed optimism of the new way of working.
Yeah.
And the second is that the revolution may never come for most people. I take your point. Technology does seem to be shifting rapidly. I do always refer back to, and I think I nicked this from Patrick Hoverstadt, we entered the Second World War with twin, what do you call them? Biplanes,
Yeah.
with prop engines,
Mhm.
and we ended them with nuclear bombs and jet fighters. So the pace of acceleration of technology has always felt fast. And while it may be completely true that it's happening now, I think the metaphor that you used of phones is a good one, but also potentially a misleading one, because there are ecosystem niches, there are large ecosystems within organizations. Disruption is always unevenly distributed. It doesn't sweep all the way. And if we're actually, there's almost a bodhisattva vow of organizational development, that we vow not to leave anybody behind in the old bad systems while we're reinventing the fantastic new world. And the fantastic new world might not be that fantastic. Organizations that claim to be without a hierarchy, they may be at one of these enlightened, incredible developmental levels. They may also not be. They may also be places where concealed hierarchies have more power.
Mhm.
The promise of greater democracy, of role flexibility, are good ones, are worth looking at, are worth developing. But
Mhm.
they don't necessarily mean that everybody will live in peace and harmony forever in the new world. So on both of those sides, Jennifer,
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful. I think we have to bring the old thinking about human nature, about human organization
Mhm.
into the future. And we have to look after, even if it's what people in systems change like to call hospicing the old,
Yeah.
taking the old ways forward and helping through the death. I think it's one of the big lessons that we haven't learned in industrial societies or post-industrial societies around the introduction of free trade, that
Yeah.
we're not asking, free trade is better. For all kinds of reasons, particularly if there's free movement of people as well as capital, but it has implications both for the
Mhm.
new and for the old. So that's the kind of point I'm trying to make. And unless people think this is too kind of highfalutin conversation, most of my work is in organisations that exist now, that have existed for hundreds of years in very recognisable forms, and it's helping people to make sense in a more human, in a more meaningful, in a way that gets shit done. Oh, am I allowed to swear on your summit? I'm sorry. In a way that gets stuff done, but actually respects our humanity and treats people as people. If you see what I mean, and that's all it's about, really.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, it sounds to me like you're very much focused on the consensus reality type of realm where we are in the between space when we know that the old will at some point pass and the new is already here, but we haven't adjusted to it yet. And you are just in that space helping the bigger
Yeah.
organizations to make their adjustments and to humanize it also, if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely, and there is that holding a space between making the old more livable, more effective, more productive, and that might delay the revolution, and that's okay by me if it leads to some better outcomes. And keeping an eye on the new and making sure it doesn't get carried away. You know, integral, where this concept of teal comes from. I think they argue about it should be yellow, not teal, but that's interesting kind of argument. Talks about transcend and include previous stages.
Yeah.
And I think there's an awful lot of aspiration to transcend without a real understanding of including and solving, making sure that we bring the solutions to the problems of the past forward with us, as well as dealing with the unfortunate side effects of some of those problems of the past, if that makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, yeah. And so I would like to hear even more from you about this. So what in your opinion is the rationale behind the well, actually it doesn't quite help if we do it in the swinging the pendulum type of way, but how can this movement from command and control to teal take place, and why would we do it in the first place if, for example, for some organizations or for some people in organizations, they won't
Yeah.
see the sort of finish line of that?
Well, I like to talk about the possibilities of the organizations, that there are two core possibilities to humans working together in organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm creating extremes. I'm doing a polarization, but at one extreme is what is often referred to as command and control, and I think that's a definitional error, which I'll try to explain in a minute.
All right, sounds
What
interesting.
people really mean is centralized, controlling, directive management, which is about blame, about accountability in the worst sense of the word. And which is crushing of the human spirit and the human potential.
Yeah.
That kind of bureaucracy that we're all familiar with, that makes us do stupid things even though we're not stupid individuals,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the way that the organization is structured.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know, because most of us had have some kind of experience of it, that at the other extreme is something which creates a kind of flowering of the human spirit that allows us to find fulfillment in doing purposeful, meaningful, genuinely fulfilling work as part of a organization, a team, and that actually allows us to express ourselves more than we could individually, and feel something of a sense of belonging, of a sense of achievement. And you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
My point is, let me take the two types of things that we think are at the extreme ends.
Yeah.
Command and control is what's used as a shorthand for centralized, evil, crushing management.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think that's a misunderstanding. If you look back at the definition of command and control as it was codified by, I think it was the US Navy, what that actually means is maximizing discretion and the ability to act to the front line, consistent with organizational coherence.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound that bad to me. That doesn't sound that crushing. A very strong, clear intent, clear boundaries to your actions, and the actual discretion to work within them. That's something that Elliot Jacks would have recognized working in the 1950s and 60s, that Stafford Beer would have recognized, that Barry Oshry, these are my three big heroes in systemic organizational thinking, would all have seen the freedom to act within boundaries that are appropriately set and can be respected by all. And actually, that's what we're going to have to reinvent in the future world anyway, if you see what I mean.
Right. So can I just pause you there, because it's because this is really interesting. I think that many people have sort of the first definition of command and control rather than the viewpoint that you just shared with us. And so, without going into the semantics of how that came about, it's
Hmm.
really interesting and really makes you think about what is it that we actually want to evolve from, and taking the good things that are in that framework, in that way of working,
Yeah,
into a context that's totally different. And that's what I actually hear you say. So what did we learn from organizing and managing and leading so far, and what of it is going to help us in the future context, and what may not help us in the future context? Is that how you meant
absolutely.
it?
Absolutely, yeah. And look, there are some management practices that, on the whole, I believe are just bad.
Mm-hmm.
I fully subscribe to the view that no measure remains a good measure as soon as it's linked to any form of punishment or reward throughout the system. I've seen that kind of gaming going on. I've seen the canards of professionalism, of maintaining face, of political professional spin that disconnect us from our authentic humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some stuff that we need to say goodbye to. There's no doubt about that. But if I can ground this, Jennifer,
Mm-hmm.
we've just co-developed, co-created with our clients actually at Devon County Council, who we're working with at the moment.
Yeah.
A fairly old organisation. 5 core practices for leaders, which I happen to think, like most good practices, when you look at them, if you compare holacracy to stratified systems theory or something like that,
Yeah.
apply in both worlds. So they're fairly straightforward and fairly grounded. If I can just explain what I think they are, that might shed some light. Is that okay?
Yeah, and but before we go there, because we're actually now transitioning into the systemic approach,
Yeah.
and before we go there, I just have one more question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, what is the added value, in your opinion, of a systemic approach to the transition that we just talked about?
Yeah.
Because, and then we can go how we can, this is how we can frame, how we can then go into how you work with your clients and what you've developed in terms of
Yeah,
leadership.
great. No, that makes a lot of sense. So that's a really interesting question. I've got a provisional answer,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, the obvious thing to me is that I see organisations as powerfully illuminated through the lens of various forms of systems thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that you can get more explanatory power and better understanding from something that really observes, theorizes, and draws out the core underlying elements that seem to not always, not every time, but predictably and with great reliability, as Barry Oshry says, determine organizational success or failure in all kinds of different dimensions.
Right.
Can from a very mechanistic or a very simplistic or a very linear approach. And fundamentally, I think the systems thinking and the sort of meta-systemic perspective, the ability to shift perspectives, allows us to understand how things work better and navigate better in the world. There's a very straightforward answer there,
Mm-hmm.
but we talk sometimes about 6 elements of dark matter of organizational life. So I say that if you don't understand how measures affect organizational behavior,
Mm-hmm.
then you will be pulled by your de facto measures away from your true organizational purpose.
Yeah.
If you don't understand the viable systems model, the core, to me, very essential underlying organizational logic,
Mm-hmm.
then you won't see where you're going wrong in multiple dimensions. If you don't understand the role that leaders play in shaping culture, positively or negatively, productively or non-productively, then you'll be doing it accidentally, for good or for ill.
Yeah.
If you don't understand the dynamics of human relationships as soon as people are in organizational life and they're trying to share and allocate responsibilities between people, a core problem for every management system ever, then you will fall into all the dysfunctions and falling out of partnership that Barry Oshry so beautifully observes. The final two are, if you don't understand the dynamics of cultures interacting, then you will be thrown out of partnership by those dynamics overwhelming everything else.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand, and this is where I stole the dark matter concept from Patrick Hoverstadt and his patterns of strategy, organizations are structurally coupled to their environment.
Yeah.
So they will evolve in and into and with locking with their environments, and that might be fine and it might be bad. Like all of these dark matter patterns, they're all operating all the time, whether you like it or not. But if you can see them, then you can make intentional decisions. And one of the concerns I have about some of the models for the future, some of the ideas about teal and self-organization in that sense, is that they don't always have adequate planning for the emergence implications of what happens at one organizational level. So unless you have governance and understanding at multiple levels, then you're likely to get into predictable trouble. And it's that predictable trouble which is the annoying part, because we could have avoided.
Yeah. So you're actually saying that the systems thinking or the systemic lens helps you understand the underlying patterns of what's happening on the strategy level, the leadership level, culture, performance, and everything intertwined and interaction with an organization's environment. And it gives you a deeper understanding of all those dynamics. And so it's something that you do not want to leave out when you're actually trying to help organizations move and evolve forward.
I think these systemic perspectives are so powerful, and they're absolutely vital to success in organisations. Although some people are intuitive and good at them, I do want to emphasise, I don't think they're things that can be applied mechanically. They're not recipes. You have to apply everything. Only works in context, so they all have to be contextualised and understood in context, and with boundary critique, because you can't assume so the system is really only in the eyes of the observer. And so people might be looking at me. I used the word in the introduction I wrote for you that said I was an outsider. Well, I'm not that much of an outsider. I'm a middle-aged white English man with a tie and a suit and all the rest. That doesn't
depends on the type of system you are taking into perspective.
Yeah, well, when I go into teal conversations and the like, or even service design in government in the UK, they like to think of themselves as radicals. I fit the mould there of an outsider, and I've been sitting in breakfast meetings where people have made rude comments about white men in suits and thinking, hang on a second. And I'm not sure where I started that comment, Jennifer, but the point is that I think you need to critique where perspectives are coming from. You need to be aware that you're part of the system. And as I came up with recently in a discussion on systems change, the bad guys are really good at systems change, and we could be the bad guys. So that's an important element to a systems approach to understand that our identity, our observing, our intervention, our perspectives, the way we choose to draw the boundaries, all have implications as well.
Yeah. And speaking of that, so there's a couple of things that there's a fork in the road here, in the sense that you wanted to share with us an example of a client you worked with, and a systemic leadership approach that you with 5 elements that you wanted to explain. And I also want to go into a space where you just mentioned we need to be really aware of our thinking, and that the systemic view is not just a lens through which we look, but also the systems thinking helps us to examine these lens and have a meta perspective. And there are a couple of threats that I know that you also know that I'd love to hear from you. So where would you like to take it next? Like to go to the example first, or the threats of
let me go to the example first, and I think we can swing back around.
All right, let's do that.
I'm really keen to say, the science fiction warped my tiny little mind, and the philosophy too. But this is really the examples I'm talking about, we talk about 5 core practices, which are the job of management or leadership.
Mhm.
And these are not on their surface deeply systemic. And thanks to our clients and our relationship with our clients, they draw as much from the work of Brene Brown and others who are very modern, very practical thinkers and doers, helping people in organizations.
Yeah.
So we basically say you need to have 5 things in place. That's learning practices. And we have a set of things that's contextually appropriate. But the goal is to have people do reflective practice, action learning, action inquiry, actually thinking about the things that are happening in the organization, not navel gazing per se. And to try to build in practices that can allow them to do that at first, second, and third level.
Yeah.
Basically thinking about could we do the same thing better? Could we recontextualize the challenge and do things different organizationally, or should we actually be reconsidering our identity? In order to do that, you need to actually have a degree of honesty and authenticity in the organization, which is something, again, you need to practice. We use this word practice quite a lot. So we use a lot of the Chris Argyris type of work and inspired work, the ladder of inference and left-hand column exercises. What's below? What's the undiscussable, and how can you make that more discussable in organization? We use a model which is derived originally from Elliot Jacks, I think, and comes through, and we've adapted a lot from systems leadership theory, which is to say how leaders affect culture. So all leadership behaviors, organizational symbolism, and people systems are experienced, and you have a core gut reaction, not an intellectual, just an instinctive, deep reaction. And those experiences and the stories you tell about them shape a productive or an unproductive, a safe or a not safe, a mission-driven or a not mission-driven culture. And leaders need to understand how they are creating those experiential conditions for the people in the organization. So learning, honest conversations, and clarity. Clarity is the one about giving people clear boundaries, having people understand and be able then to discuss the appropriateness of task, role, team, decision-making, boundaries and processes, so that people know where they are, because it's a key tenet that you can't exercise discretion unless you know what will get you in trouble by having too little discretion or showing too much. So those 4, learning, honest conversations, culture, and clarity, create a kind of engine room of an organization that can learn. That only really comes to life, though, when you directly connect to purpose. And in the sense of service organizations and public service, that is really understanding and then measuring, working against what matters to citizens. So those are the 5 things that we're working with at the moment, that are recently introduced and will probably get knocked around. But I hope you can see those are practices. They're practical. They're things for managers to work on, rather than being very, very conceptual and high flying, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, beautiful. And I recognise these 5, at least these 5, also in our earlier conversations at the Systemic Leadership Summit. What popped up for me when you were mentioning these 5, especially when you were talking about clarity, just maybe a sidestep, but how does that relate to transparency?
It's an interesting question. So we mean clarity of what a person's work is in that sense, but in a culture that is practicing learning and honesty effectively, that will tends to generate the potential for transparency. It will tend to generate inquiry into why decisions were made the way that they were made, particularly if people are very sensitive to that culture shaping approach. I'm interested to throw that back to you, Jennifer. Tell me what transparency means to you, and why that's important to systemically led organizations.
Well, it didn't pop up for me in the sense that it's an important thing. What I do know is that it's both in profit, non-profit, and public and private sector, it's a word that pops up a lot. Also in what is authentic leadership, what is good management, what is, and these are questions that pop up for leaders in the sense that, do we support our system? Do we support our customers, or do we support our citizens by being as transparent as possible, or does that actually prevent us from doing our work? And so clarity and transparency are sometimes mixed up. And so that's why I asked you that question.
Oh, that's great. I mean, they're clearly related concepts, but I have seen attempts at radical transparency in organizations that are not authentic, that we find a lot of pain. I think that trauma is not really too strong a word in some of the organizations that we work with. And a really useful little tool that we sometimes work with is Patricia Clarkson's concept of levels of intervention.
Okay.
We're trying to get organizations to do work at a developmental level. And I can't recall them all off the top of my head, but there are about 5 levels that Clarkson identified.
Yeah.
Another great thinker from the 70s or 80s. And her point is, if you've got conflict and uncertainty and vagueness, then you can't go straight to a developmental level. You have to work with the presenting challenges first. This is from a therapeutic point of view, but I think it applies.
Yeah.
And you have to work through. And so in an organization that's in conflict or in trauma or in uncertainty, just introducing radical transparency could, as you hinted, be quite destructive. You have to get people to a place where they are have worked through and are able to cope with some of those issues, and B, have some practices around something like our honesty and learning conversations and so on, before I think that you could really be sure that would be constructive. But increasing levels of transparency, I do think, would come with the territory and might be a practice that you would want to adopt and develop.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And so these 5 leadership practices, you mentioned that they are not necessarily directly, that they stem from a systemic perspective. But on the other hand, if you would take them away or not do them, then it would be really hard to do any type of systemic approach.
Yeah, I mean, and they're core organisational development in a sense, I would say, and in context, what we're trying to do is do very radical, outside-in, customer purpose-based service transformations. And the leadership and organisational development work, in a sense, started from the paradigm of leaders are wrong, how can we stop them blocking this radical, revolutionary change, and has evolved into an understanding that we need to work both on the service system and on the leadership system and context. That will allow, I think, organizational redesign, enterprise architecture in the true sense of a trade-off of competing priorities between, or a balance of exploration and exploitation, differentiation and integration, those kind of polarities that actually need to be actively managed in organizations. So I do think that they're enablers of systemic change, but frankly, they're enablers of that thing of connecting with our humanity. Understanding that people can perform well when they have clarity, when they are receiving positive, when they are feeling emotionally engaged with the culture, not emotionally disengaged, when they have a sense of understanding what the organizational customer purpose is, and when they believe that people are trying to be honest and trying to learn. Those are things which create a bit of an unlocking of change and potential in organizations, full stop, don't they? And I guess sometimes we come into interventions with a naive assumption that those are all in place. When people are investing so much psychic energy in protecting themselves against the pain they felt or they know they could feel within the organization, that just ain't so, and you need to do the work to get it in place.
Yeah, yeah. And so would you then say, and I'm trying to bridge back to the systemic and what's
Yeah.
systemic approach and how you do that. So you worked with this client, you have these 5 leadership, I have the tendency to call them principles almost, for development. And and then how is the rest of the approach then shaped, and where does this systemic come in even more?
So I think we are trying with, in this case, as I hinted at, to do environment to system 1, environment to operations, reconfiguration, transformation, for want of a better word, in a sort of in 2 senses. So let me refer to another concept, if you don't mind. We have a concept which is heavily based on the viable systems model, that to any organizational challenge, whether it's a place shaping complex thing or a business unit, you can apply customer world or citizen world, service world, management and leadership worlds, and the world of learning and change. And you have to think about all 5 of those worlds and the relationships between them if you want real transformation. So there is a kind of Deming process as a system. I don't think it's truly systemic, but I think it's application of systems thinking to a production, a service process that flows between custom world and service world in viable systems terms, environment system 1, the interface, the boundary, where the real value gets created, where the work gets done. So there's practical systemic work happening there to get people to understand what actually matters to citizens, and to build service systems that can fulfill that, can supply that. Then you shift out into citizen world and start to say, wouldn't it be better if people had the capacity and capability to meet their needs in their communities themselves, could do self-help, could do early intervention, and you get into more of a place shaping or a systems change idea. But back into the organization, it would serve very little if we just created really good customer demand focused service silos that were great at just providing to meet customer demands. If we lost the ability to influence and shape the place and get out there into system world and shape, but also if we lost organizational coherence and sense of purpose and the ability of the organization to supply the resource needs and manage and understand how the organization was working. So from the outside in, from citizen into service world to the bottom up, top down dynamics of management and leadership world, you have to balance the 2. And actually, that's the core of the viable systems model. Can operations match the complexity, match the variety of what the environment is throwing at it, and can management match the complexity of what operations are throwing at it? So we're doing service redesigns, we're doing leadership work, and then we're starting to get into the enterprise architecture of, do we need to change HR policies? Do we need to change our recruitment and retention approach? And do we need to change our decision-making and governance approaches and structures over a long period of time? But this is not overnight work. This is not radical, exciting, install a new operating system transformation, which is a pretty dodgy metaphor. This is, and I like your word principles. You know, we talk a lot about principles, but we prefer to say practices because we want people to actually practice and actually do and actually build their practice, build their learning about how they put these principles into use. If you see what I mean.
So actually, what you're saying in your approach, you use the viable systems model to show the different. I have the tendency to call them spaces, where to look and where the things, the areas that need to be taken into account. To not just have a viable system, but also a coherent system, and also a system that strives to get to a space of well-being of all these spaces when they are interacting and when they are connecting.
That's lovely. That's very well put, Jennifer. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, right.
So it's recognizing the humanity in all of these systems. And I understand your word spaces. The reason we say worlds is because the experience and the sense making, the meaning making in each of these spaces actually quite radically different. And of course, these are gross oversimplifications. The VSM is a fractal model. It's a recursive model. So you have all of these worlds replicating at multiple different levels. But somebody in service world has a different way of sense making to somebody interacting with the same problem in management world. So we think it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, yeah. And that brings me back to a couple of really core elements to systemic approaches, and in the sense of how we discuss them here in the Systemic Leadership Summit. And that is the element that you just mentioned is very much also about giving the system, the organizational system and its environment a chance to look at itself from different meaning-making spaces, so that once there is an increased awareness of where all the meaning-making is, then there are so many more possibilities for optimization, because as soon as you interact and start combining them instead of being in the silos, then there's so much more possible because you have different perspectives in there.
I think that's really powerful. I absolutely agree. The ability to see from and understand different perspectives. I mean, core to our approach is the aspiration to create cognitive shifts, or at least productive cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
By showing people the experience that they may be implicated in creating the conditions for in different worlds. And this all comes back to humanity in a sense, doesn't it? You know, whether it is, I used to massively advocate for back to the floor exercises for senior managers, and I only gave up because nobody ever did it. But whether it's seeing, because of a left-hand column discussion, the emotional experience of a member of your own management team, to the way that the organization and the management team works, and just creating that moment of empathy and a little bit of understanding of the rest, or whether it's really taking the very senior leaders to see the implications of their budget setting processes, of their target setting processes, of their structural conditions on the real customer, the real citizen experience. I absolutely agree. It's a bit more than there's some quite naive stuff about empathy and seeing other people's perspectives. It's not as easy or as straightforward as we would like it to be, unfortunately. But creating the experiences where people get a sample of other people's worlds, or at least see how their actions are impacting on other people's worlds. Those are really powerful systemic shifts and create, interventions.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for sharing that. And so it almost sounds like we can't go wrong with the systemic approach. But I'm sure that you dare to differ.
Yes.
In terms of and so and I know this, so I'm really curious, where can we, because we can be all over the moon with the systemic approach and what that does, but there's also spaces and places where we can go wrong with it. So could you share with us your view on that?
Yeah, so I think that we tend to go wrong again in some, maybe there's a dark matter of systems thinking thing going on here. Not always, not every time, but predictably and with great reliability, across two polarities. One is the intention to say our tools are right. These are all a little bit about fighting for territory. A great guy on enterprise architecture, a guy called Richard Verriard, wrote an article called Wrecking Synergy to Stake Out Territory. So our tools are right versus your tools are wrong is a popular battleground that draws us away from systems thinking as constituted by just the value it generates. Fighting for power over and a naive approach to power too are ways that we can go wrong. So we talk, and this is a bit exaggerated, a bit tongue-in-cheek, about 4 quadrants of systems thinking threats.
Okay.
We say there's the naive enthusiasts who've got one thing, and it's generated huge insight for them, kind of, oh my god, like I experienced once, this is why I'm right and my managers are wrong. The naive enthusiasts, whether it's people who are now doing customer journey mapping in service design for the first time, and this is the thing that will make a difference, or people who come across the Deming or the lean type of approach, who just think their thing will change the world. Why aren't they letting me? Why are the barriers? I think there are deliberate oversimplifiers who are trying to generate a following, often by putting down other approaches, and are still oversimplistic, are trying to teach people that you can do this in a recipe, you can buy the very colourful workbook and follow it through and you will have transformation. There are gurus who are really seeking to own the territory, own the intellectual property, and have power through their systems thinking insights. And the weird thing about that is the more successful a guru they are, usually depends on how good their model actually is.
Yeah.
That's not always true, but certainly some of the strongest defensive gurus and people with power over and who seek to lay down the law have some of the best ideas, but they only have some ideas. And then there's curmudgeons, and I very easily fall into the curmudgeon quadrant myself.
Okay, what are curmudgeons?
Curmudgeon. It's a great old-fashioned English word, I think. With grumpy old sods, usually old men, who are basically sort of saying, but you haven't listened to the history, you haven't quoted things right, you've misattributed that origin of that concept, and all the rest of it, if you see what I mean. All of the others, the naive enthusiasts, the popularizers, and the gurus are all united and find it pretty easy to shout down the curmudgeons. And the curmudgeons very often get attached to their outsider status, and their not being listened to becomes part of their identity. So quite there's interesting dynamics in all of these.
And what I find interesting about it is that in one way or another, it's like in all these 4 threats, there's this layer that goes over systems thinking for these, and where it becomes linear again.
Yes.
Because whether you have a guru or whether you have someone who just is pinpointing at what's missing, especially historical or factual, or people who are in the one size fits all and here's the recipe, or people who say, oh, this is it, kumbaya. It's all it's a tendency to take the systemic and pull it back into the linear. That's what I hear.
Yes, and doesn't that somehow relate back to our original points that they all think that they are generating a paradigm shift, but they've kind of leapt wholeheartedly onto the pendulum and kind of swung over or swung back too far. So there's some kind of metaphor to be got there, isn't there? Definitely.
Yeah. So is this the paradox that you're trying to?
That's the paradox. Absolutely. That the enticement of systems thinking is to say this is just another more powerful level of linear thinking. That's probably not exactly the right comparison. There's a story in a Terry Pratchett book about Terry Pratchett, the sort of comedy fantasy author. He has a little metaphor, I think it's him, could be Douglas Adams, one of those people, about tree frogs in the Amazon.
Yeah.
who grow up in ponds entirely encased in a large leaf in an Amazonian forest.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the moment when the tree frog gets to the edge of the leaf and somehow manages to look over, and suddenly the whole universe that it thought was constituted entirely within this leaf expands massively.
Yeah.
But his point is that that's not the end of the experience. That's mostly our first flash of insight.
Mm-hmm.
But what tempers you and sometimes leaves you a little bit hackneyed and so on, there's always the edge of the leaf out there.
Yeah.
It's not just that one insight. That there are leaves within leaves within leaves, and that there is always more to learn, and ways in which we can be wrong, and ways in which we can make ourselves wrong. I've tried to extend that far enough, but you get the idea.
Yeah, yeah. So isn't that part of the evolutionary process then anyway? That the ever unfolding leaves. I'm just making this up as I'm sitting here.
That's nice. No, I absolutely agree. And I suppose that is the evolutionary process. And although I think that there are things discovered, certainly by Barry Oshry and by Stafford Beer, that are in a sense true rules. I think there are some true systems rules.
Mm-hmm.
I am very, very wary of any approach that doesn't itself evolve.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that actually doesn't show learning in application to different contexts.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something that I really share with you as we've now entered into the 4th edition of the Systemic Leadership Summit. And I've been looking at systemic from so many different angles and so many different um, things that get emphasized within that big field. And I also find some really interesting dynamics. So where you say, I'm wary about approaches that don't evolve themselves. And I'm also very wary when there's no interaction with other systemic approaches, or when there is fights with these other systemic approaches, like, okay, they do that and we do this. And as long as we don't mix, we know that's also systemic what they're doing, but we're doing something else. And
Absolutely.
I'm like, how is this field going to evolve if we keep disconnecting, if we keep but that's my old journey with the summit.
I absolutely agree. Well, you've been through quite interesting experiential learning journey doing all. It would warp anybody's mind to do this many conversations and interviews.
Well, we're talking about, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the paradoxes and the polarities, and wanting to create a paradigm shift for and to do that in service of the transformation of organizations, so that they can ever grow to that potential, and that the people in it can also ever grow to that potential. And so where does this leave us then? Because we've been talking about transformations in the public service in this pendulum thing that does not necessarily work, and that it's also about sitting in the in-between and working with the in-between, and that's to harder work. And how even when we use systemic approaches, it's really important to be aware and alert when we do that, and that we not slip in something else than the systemic, which is usually the linear. So where does this leave us then with the paradigm shift? So well, if it's not the linear, it's the ego.
Sorry,
can you say that again?
I said, if it's not the linear that slips in, it's the ego and the lust for power and the power and attention and celebrity and all of those kind of things. All of those things are the shadow, which is always with us. Speaking personally, at least.
Yeah, I call that the disconnectedness.
Mm.
The ego
Yeah.
wanting, seeing itself separate from everything else, and then wanting to have everything else to, because it
Yeah.
is separate.
Yes, absolutely.
So
What's
paradigm shift then.
Well, what's interesting is that paradigm shift sounds awfully like a purpose,
Mm.
and it sounds like quite a self-appointed, important purpose, and that in itself can be very narrowing and very isolating and cutting off. I mean, I do think we have to have some discrimination. We have to have boundaries, and we have to make judgments about what techniques, what approaches, even what systems thinking is, relatively useful or not useful in a context.
Mhm.
But there is something dangerous about mission and purpose. And every now and again, I can't let myself do this too often in the course of a working day. But there's a brilliant paper written by Marv Weisbord, who with Sandra. Created future. The large group future shaping
Mhm.
process
Yeah.
with Sandra. I want to say Sandra. I'm thinking of the wrong Sandra. Sorry, that's why I've got it in my head. I was also Peter Block's consulting partner back in the day,
Mhm.
and it's called Techniques to Match Our Values. It's a short paper that I entirely encourage people to read.
Mhm.
Much like another Peter Block associate. The guy who was involved in the development of asset-based community developments, a paper that says services are bad for people. It's
Oh,
worth reading these
interesting.
things that confront, absolutely. Marv Weisbord's point was that in the evolution from the eager young consultant who could take on any challenge and win any day, through to something else, he learned to let sleeping dogs lie, let things be, respect the way they are in organizational life. So, as I say, I don't like to approach that chasm too deeply.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Peter Block says all help is an act of colonialism. Um, so yeah, wow. But there is something about being not so caught up in our own sense of purpose.
Hmm.
For me, I just anchor it in that bit of the humanness and humanity. The only actual arbiter of our activities is in maybe the growth, but definitely the experience of the people in the organisation as a result of our interventions, and of the people who are served by or meet with or have to work with the organisation. And those are the things that anchor me. And if there can be one or many paradigm shifts as part of that, that sounds quite fulfilling and quite interesting. But really, we're just getting. That's what we're after. We're after that improvement in human experience
Mhm.
through different language, different thinking, different ways of being with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. This is what you're actually saying, and I really want to get this right. So correct me if I'm wrong. But what you're saying is, when you work with client organizations, what you do is you help to expand awareness, and you help expand possibility, and you help expand different viewpoints, so that the organization itself and the people in it can work towards a better experience and more well-being.
Yes, I would be quite proud to say I did that without any intent or purpose or direction setting.
Mhm.
That's not the case. We do it with some clear, but hopefully mostly fairly declared and honest intent and purpose and setting of direction, some kind of steering of what we think is good and what we think is bad,
Mhm.
to use really linear extremes. Um, but we're trying to give them practices that allow them to actually evaluate different ways of doing things against the real impact on the experience of people in and outside the organization.
Yeah.
And yes, so yes, all of those things: expanding awareness, expanding possibilities, expanding thinking, but with the goal of being more conscious about the actual outcomes that we are generating in the world.
Yeah, yeah. And so if I flip this back to you, so if we change the camera, or at least the camera from which you are talking, from your clients to you, and I know that you fulfill so many different roles, and you interact with so many people who practice the systemic also in your network. What has expanded in the systems in your life and in you?
That's a very good question.
Because usually it mirrors, that's what systems do. So when you work with clients, and without being too mission and purpose driven, you help them to create a better human experience and expand their consciousness. Then usually that works both ways. So what has expanded in your consciousness through the systemic?
I would say that my sense of irony has grown. That my ability to be self-reflective, which started very, very low, has grown somewhat. I did when I was at PwC, which was quite good at giving you all of these profiling and things like that. I think I scored as 100th percentile in activist, 99th percentile in pragmatist. There was another one that theorist was moderate, and then reflector was about 18%. So perhaps I'm more balanced in that way now. What's really grown in me? Discussed this with a colleague, Gareth, a few times. Is a sense of being normal. A reduction of the sense of exceptionalism. Not in all the ways that it matters, unfortunately, not all the time, but that kind of ability to laugh at myself and see my own ridiculousness is certainly there. And actually, to see myself as more normal, less exceptional, and more part of things. So perhaps just a slow, incremental, partial reduction of the perspective of seeing myself as the center of the universe to a slightly more realistic state. But as Douglas Adams teaches us, the last thing you can afford to have in life is a true sense of universal perspective.
Benjamin, we've almost come to the end of our conversation, which I think is a shame that we're there, because I'd love to talk to you for so much longer than this. But on that reflective note that you just shared about the impact on you, when we go to the viewers and everyone who's watching this session right now, out of all of we've discussed, what is it that, if you were to influence that, what would you like everyone to take away from our conversation?
What I'm thinking of right now, Jennifer, is the arc as I've seen it over my life of the Star Wars narrative. I spent a year in the United States when I was about 5 or 6, something like that, and you couldn't get me out of the movie theater watching Star Wars. So I think as you enter into or journey on the journey of systems, whatever, because there are so many brands and hashtags out there now, it is a bit like experimenting with the Force. It does kind of take you to those quadrants, the temptations of the dark side. If you examine the dark side closely. It'll examine you back, as Nietzsche might say. You'll see yourself in it, and you might well move through the heroism of being the sole savior of the universe and so on. But what I loved about the most recent Star Wars main canon movie, or whatever you want to say, is that while it still had the Force, the heroic characters, and all the rest. We don't talk about the first three films, or the first in order. It was about a team effort. It was about shades of grey, and no longer the very clear good guys against the Nazis kind of metaphor.
Yeah.
And there's a hint that maybe everybody has the power of the Force. So I think that's the journey that people might be embarking on, or might be quite a long way down the road of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an incredibly fulfilling journey, even if, like most of those classic adventure stories, it tends to kind of leave you right back where you started.
Yeah.
That's not so inspiring, but you'll have some adventures along the way, I suppose, is the point.
Well, I guess I think that from what you just said, we do have a paradigm shift here, and that is that the hero's journey that we are so used to, that is very focused on the one person saving the world, is maybe so part of our DNA that moving into the systemic and changing the narratives that we love seeing is part of the journey that we're on right now.
Brilliant. I wholeheartedly endorse that belief.
Well, we've come to the end. We've been talking about paradoxes and polarities and paradigm shifts, about transformations and possibilities for transformation in the public services sector. We've been talking about your approach when it comes to the systemic, and how you work with clients, and how you develop and co-create leadership principles, ways of working to go on a journey with the organization where you can find expanded awareness, expanded consciousness towards an environment where people can feel more human, where they can work on the well-being of the people inside and outside the organization who interact with them. And we've been talking about your journey and where you find yourself when you look back on your experience with the systemic. And I'm sure that everyone who's been watching found this a very intriguing session. So thank you so much, Benjamin, for being in conversation with me today. And hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And to everyone who's been watching, please go to our online community space and talk about what this session did for you, if it raised any questions and thoughts or reflections on your own process when it comes to working in the systemic realm and shaping your leadership. I'd like to say thank you so much for watching. Take care. See you next session. Bye-bye.